On April 12th, a highly anticipated U.S.-Iran negotiation took place in Pakistan's capital, Islamabad, but ended without results. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance led a large team that quickly left, while President Trump sent a strong message through social media and public statements. He emphasized the need to fully block the Strait of Hormuz to cut off Iran's economic lifeline, and made it clear that China should not supply weapons to Iran. The risk of escalating conflict remains. The presence of a large U.S. delegation showed the seriousness and strength of their position. The team, led by Vice President Vance, consisted of over 300 people, including key figures trusted by Trump, Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Adding to the pressure, the highest-ranking military commander, General Brad Cooper, was also part of the team, sending a silent message that if diplomacy fails, military options are ready to go. As Vance's team arrived in Islamabad, Pakistan took extreme security measures. Parts of the city were under near-curfew conditions, with military and police patrolling the streets and fighter jets flying overhead. The talk seemed almost like a carefully staged display of power. In contrast, the Iranian delegation's arrival was marked by awkwardness. Led by Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the team included 78 representatives, including Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, a representative for the Supreme Leader in the Defense Committee, and Central Bank Governor Abdel Nasser Hemati. However, the delegation was already torn apart by internal power struggles before even leaving. What was even more concerning was that, at a critical moment, Iran couldn't even find a reliable government plane for the trip. Israel had nearly destroyed all of Iran's official planes in previous airstrikes. In a scramble, the Iranian delegation had to use two regular commercial airliners, an Airbus A321 and an A320. This decision wasn't just about convenience, but a response to fears of attacks during the journey. None of the high-ranking officials dared to fly on the same plane. Some joked that Iran's trip was more of a humiliating and dangerous escape. The talks started at dawn on the 11th, lasting 21 hours, making it the highest-level direct diplomatic contact between the U.S. and Iran since 1979. There were significant differences between the two sides. The U.S. had a clear and firm bottom line. Iran must not develop nuclear weapons, and it must immediately dispose of its stockpiles of high-concentration uranium close to weapon-grade levels. The U.S. also demanded that the Strait of Hormuz be fully reopened to restore normal international shipping and not be used as leverage to manipulate the energy market. Additionally, Iran must stop supporting armed proxies in the Middle East, especially Hezbollah. On the other hand, Iran insisted on its right to peaceful nuclear energy and was unwilling to give up its enriched uranium. At the same time, Iran bundled the lifting of sanctions, the release of frozen assets, control over the strait, and continued support for proxies as bargaining chips. In simple terms, the U.S. wanted to negotiate the handing over of dangerous materials, while Iran wanted to keep the dangerous materials and demand breathing space in return. This fundamental disconnect meant that both sides were stuck, even after moving from indirect contact to face-to-face talks. No one expected Iran to act so arrogantly at the negotiating table. Despite the large U.S. team led by J.D. Vance, the Iranian delegation made it clear that they would not give up their enriched uranium. It seems they still want to build a nuclear bomb. What gave Iran the confidence to be so unyielding? On April 7th, the U.S. and Iran reached a 2-week ceasefire agreement, providing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, a brief respite to strengthen its combat readiness. A recent CNN report seems to have brought this concern to the forefront. Sources recently told CNN that U.S. intelligence indicates China is preparing to deliver a new air defense system to Iran within the next few weeks. This intelligence highlights that Iran may be using the ceasefire to seek foreign assistance in replenishing certain weapon systems. China may route these supplies through third countries to conceal the true origin and avoid direct involvement in the conflict. Once this intelligence was made public, it raised alarms in Washington. The weapons in question are mainly shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. While these missiles may not reverse the overall battlefield situation, they can significantly raise the cost of U.S. military operations, keeping both pilots and ground troops constantly on edge. What's more concerning is that this supply is not just a simple arms deal, but part of a strategic extension. Iran is attempting, with the support of its strategic partners, to prolong the conflict at a lower intensity. In other words, Iran aims to transform the battlefield from large-scale direct confrontations to a prolonged harassment campaign. China's support for Iran is far from being merely ally assistance. It is a well-calculated strategic game involving economic, military, and technological aspects. This becomes especially prominent during the fragile window of the current ceasefire in the Middle East. For China, Iran's value lies in two main points: a stable oil supply channel and a useful tool to counterbalance the U.S. As long as tensions in the Middle East persist, the U.S. will have to allocate significant military force, intelligence resources, and diplomatic efforts to the Gulf region. This naturally dilutes its focus on other fronts, especially the Taiwan Strait and the Indo-Pacific region. Beijing's calculation is that Iran doesn't need to win a comprehensive victory. As long as Iran can continue creating risks, depleting U.S. resources, and raising the cost of war, it will serve China's global strategy. For years, China has mainly provided Iran with dual-use technology or components affected by sanctions, avoiding direct confrontation with U.S. red lines. However, if the delivery of shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles becomes a reality, it would signify a clear escalation of support. These weapons are highly mobile, easy to operate, and well-suited to Iran's asymmetric warfare style. They would force the U.S. to pay a higher price for low-altitude operations, without directly involving China in military confrontation. The use of third countries for delivery further underscores China's cunning. It aims to resupply Iran while keeping the traces as obscure as possible. This intelligence was deliberately leaked by the U.S. through CNN at the beginning of the ceasefire period, and the timing is far from coincidental. Trump plans to visit Beijing in May to meet with Xi Jinping, and the public disclosure of this news clearly indicates that Washington is ramping up pressure on China ahead of the talks. The message from Washington is clear. The U.S. intelligence community is fully aware of these actions, and China should not think it can operate quietly behind the scenes. It is likely that during the Trump-Xi meeting, the issue of Iran will be linked to discussions on trade, technology, and the Taiwan Strait. Trump will emphasize that if China continues to challenge U.S. interests in sensitive areas, it will face broader consequences. If Trump imposes a 50% tariff on Chinese goods, it could break the trade truce between the U.S. and China. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Mike Waltz, made it clear during a UN Security Council meeting that Chinese entities have exported significant amounts of components for attack drones and ballistic missile technology to Iran. These exports aren't always made directly through Chinese companies, but often involve front companies in Iran, Malaysia, and Hong Kong to cover their tracks and make it harder to trace. Waltz's statement comes from accumulated intelligence, aiming to remind the international community that Iran's military capabilities are being continuously bolstered by external support, directly threatening regional stability and the interests of the U.S. and its allies. Waltz also pointed out that China has supplied Iran with more sensitive systems, such as anti-ship cruise missiles and surface-to-air missiles. This support is especially concerning in the context of the recent shooting down of 2 U.S. aircraft by Iran in early April. One was an advanced F-15E Strike Eagle bomber, and the other was an A-10 Warthog attack plane. The downing of the F-15E, which took place over southwestern Iran, marked the first confirmed loss of a manned U.S. aircraft in this conflict. Although the crew was rescued, the incident itself came at a heavy cost for the United States. Iran claimed it used its domestic air defense system to intercept the planes, but analysts believe this was made possible by China's missile technology and external component support. The fate of the A-10 also highlights the vulnerability of low-altitude threats. These slow, close-support planes are more exposed to shoulder-fired or mid- to low-altitude missiles. During the war, China's support for Iran's military goes beyond finished weapons. Intelligence shows that Beijing has been providing missile fuel precursors, AI-assisted intelligence analysis, and key technical assistance to rebuild Iran's ballistic missile systems. Sodium perchlorate, a key component for solid rocket fuel, has been repeatedly shipped through Chinese ports and delivered to Iranian ports aboard ships flying the Iranian flag. Tracking reports indicate that at least 4 or 5 such shipments have been completed since the war broke out, with enough cargo to support the production of hundreds of ballistic missiles. These materials are nominally civilian chemicals, but are highly militarized in practice, helping Iran quickly replenish its missile stockpiles after taking hits. Chinese affairs expert Gordon Chang advised the U.S. to take stronger actions, including seizing these transport vessels. Chang believes that China's support has gone beyond commercial trade and is essentially an indirect confrontation with the U.S. military on the battlefield, endangering the safety of U.S. pilots and ground troops. If Washington hesitates to act against these vessels, it sends a message of weakness to Beijing, making it harder to effectively curb this gray zone support. On the battlefield in the Middle East, Iran's resistance has exceeded expectations. After almost all of its visible targets, including top leadership, Navy, Air Force, and ballistic missile launch facilities, were destroyed, the IRGC has dispersed and moved underground. Iranian military personnel, especially those backed by the IRGC and involved with terrorist groups, continue to intermittently harass ships in the Strait of Hormuz and launch missile attacks on oil facilities in Israel and Arab countries. On April 7th, Iran's highest mediator claimed that Iran still possesses 45,000 drones and 15,000 ballistic missiles, enough to continue the strategy indefinitely. However, the actual numbers may be far lower. Nonetheless, the presence of drone swarms and missile stockpiles is enough to hold the world's oil hostage. The power of this asymmetric deterrence lies in the fact that it doesn't aim to win the war, but to infinitely raise the cost of conflict. The U.S. and its allies must invest vast resources to defend, patrol, and protect energy facilities, while Iran only needs sporadic attacks to keep the entire region on edge. For the U.S., this means a strategic war of attrition, and for the global community, it means prolonged instability in energy markets. On April 11th, President Trump warned that if China continues to deliver weapons to Iran, it could invite big trouble. This was not just a deterrent to Iran, but also a direct pressure on China. Just days before, when the U.S. and Iran reached a 2-week ceasefire agreement, Trump sent another strong message on social media, that any country that provides military weapons to Iran will immediately face a 50% punitive tariff on all their exports to the U.S. Just before the ceasefire announcement, Israel carried out an airstrike on the China-Iran Railway, the first direct attack on the core interests of China's Belt and Road Initiative. The China-Iran Railway is seen as another critical lifeline for Iran's economy. On the surface, Israel struck the railway, but in reality, it targeted Iran's purse, lifeline, and weapons transport route. Analysts point out that the U.S. is applying pressure on both fronts by militarily blocking Iran's supply lines and imposing tariffs to deter China. The U.S. is using multiple strategies to prevent Iran from forming a strong alliance with China. On a deeper level, if China continues to fuel the conflict, the costs could be substantial. First is the economic backlash. China's export volume to the U.S. is enormous, and the trade war between the two countries has already been going on for years, leaving manufacturing and supply chains vulnerable. If a 50% punitive tariff is implemented, China's export industries will face a heavy blow, further worsening its already fragile economy. Second is the energy crisis. As the world's second-largest economy, China is highly dependent on energy stability. An escalation of the Middle East conflict will inevitably drive up oil prices and disrupt shipping. If the Strait of Hormuz remains blocked, China's existing oil reserves will be under immense pressure. Rising oil prices will not only impact industrial production, but could also trigger social dissatisfaction and unrest, threatening the Chinese Communist Party's rule. In other words, the restart and escalation of the Iran conflict is not only a confrontation between the U.S. and Iran, but also a game between the U.S. and China. Trump will not allow China to win, as shown by his consistent approach. After the collapse of the U.S.-Iran talks, his warnings to China have only intensified. In the future, there may be more targeted actions against China in areas such as financial sanctions, shipping surveillance, and the technology supply chain. If China miscalculates and continues to provide substantial support to Iran, it may prolong Iran's resistance in the short term.